We'll start with the beautiful Karis on the end. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what part of Portland you're from?
All right. My name is Karis Stoudemire Phillips, and I was born and raised in Portland. Actually, first residence that we had was on 11th and Ainsworth, and then I moved to North Michigan Avenue when I was in second grade, I think. Second grade to North Michigan Avenue. And the now historic Mississippi wasn't historic Mississippi when I was there growing up, but that's what it's called now, and spent over 30 years of my life with my family right there between Skidmore and Mason.
All right, thank you, Ms. Karis. And can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of how you came to be in Portland? Are you an original resident or a transplant?
Yeah, my name is Jamie Kazi, and I'm an original Portlander. Grew up on Northeast Sumner and Martin Luther King, so right off of MLK in Alberta. I bounced around Northeast Portland just after I got out of high school, but I actually moved back to my old family house recently, so I stayed in the neighborhood.
All right, cool. And our illustrious guest over here, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Cleo Davis. I grew up off of 7th and Ainsworth, 8th and Ainsworth, then 8th and Beach, and then 13th and Shaver. So kind of moving all around Portland. My father is a property owner. My grandparents bought properties around here, so it's kind of like even when you have a commercial property, you grow up on that commercial property having a business and stuff, so it's kind of all over, also on Williams.
And so that was my second question. What was your neighborhood like growing up? And so, Cleo, you gave us a little, just a tiny bit. You want to give us a little bit more of a growing up?
What the neighborhood was like.
Yes.
So honestly, it fluctuates for me, depending on the time period that we're talking about. And those different time periods have different experiences. Like I was listening to the interviews before about how, the community and neighborhood used to be. I was coming up, I was born in the 70s, so I was getting the tail end of what the neighborhood really used to be when it was really cohesive. So like being a 70s baby and then coming of age in the 80s, two different kind of dichotomies. The neighborhood was really in flux, in transition. So we had a lot of that was discussed before with, the tight-knit communities and family members living like next door to each other or right around the corner. And we shared a lot within the community, but also was the beginning of that breakdown. The things that like right now we begin to see and talk about redlining and gentrification and all the blight and nuisance ordinances, the things that were placed on us from poor policy. But also we had that so-called war on drugs that flooded our neighborhood and communities with drugs. So that's where you had that, but then you had this whole thing where the community was beginning to become poisoned, and we started to not be as cohesive. So I remember when like the drugs hit was the first time where, when I was growing up, you didn't say nothing about nobody's mama unless you was ready unless you was ready to get dealt with. So this was the first time that really the way that we looked at our mothers and everything began to change, because you had folks within the family fighting about how you address mama or who comes into the house, because when crack hit, people were stealing from their mamas.
Right.
So it depends on which direction I'm going to go when I say how the neighborhood and the community was, So my experience is both of those experiences and working and dealing with that.
And that's exactly what I was in. The group before you guys were a little older group, and then so it's nice to have this younger group to get a different perspective. And so I'm going to switch to Mr. Jamie over here so we can get a little information about what you thought about your neighborhood growing up, and was it similar to what I grew up in the 60s and 70s, or Cleo?
Well, I grew up in the 90s in my neighborhood, and I was lucky enough to have like my family not next door, but they were down pretty close off of, like Skidmore and Rodney, and I had 4 older brothers that had grown up in the same area, so I felt like I had not only like protection against some of the stuff that was happening in the neighborhood, but also just like guidance on how to move through the city and where I could go, and when I needed one of them to go with me somewhere, I had that available to me as well. And I was lucky enough that like at least my block, we were pretty like close-knit group. I remember there was an older black woman across the street who always had all the neighborhood gossip and knew everyone in the neighborhood, so she was kind of somewhere that I could go and just like sit and listen to stories about the neighborhood. So I learned a lot from her. So like at my age at that time, I wasn't kind of privy to all the fractures that were happening in the city and in the community, because I felt kind of not isolated, but just like taken care of in my neighborhood, and there was kids on my neighborhood that were my age, so it felt like a normal experience. But as I grew older and had more of those conversations with those people at my like different level of consciousness, I could see how like that microcosm of what was happening in my neighborhood wasn't happening in a larger kind of black community in Portland.
And the reason why I asked you that question, because you did look like you grew up in the 90s. You look like my kid's age. So what I was thinking was that the cohesiveness of the black community was still pretty tight in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We all saw fractures. But it's nice to hear from a different perspective, because we were really close in the 60s. Like, I know everybody in Portland connected, but I didn't. But that's how we thought, because, we were all connected. And so, Karis, what would be your take on growing up in Northeast at that time?
Yeah, I was of that next generation, I would say, because all my aunts and uncles, and so my generation is that next generation of family that all knew each other. So there's still that connectedness that, you couldn't go to the corner store without somebody knowing you're so-and-so's daughter or so-and-so's niece, nephew. So you always had that. And like I said, I grew up in the now historic Mississippi. And so when I think about Williams Avenue, as Cleo talked about, Williams Avenue didn't look like it does now, but there were businesses. There were businesses there in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And I always go back to Willie Harris, because Willie Harris owned like a whole block. He owned from Fremont all the way to Beach. Like, absolutely. He owned all of that. And I'll tell a quick story. I remember I went to St. Mary's Academy downtown, and so I took the bus to school. Usually from school, because my mom worked downtown, so I get a ride to school, but I took the bus home. And I got off the bus right there in front of the store, and was out there talking to some friends and stuff. And as soon as I got home, the phone rang, and my mom was like, "What were you doing over on Williams at the store?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She was like, "Willie already called me and told me that you were at the store. You're supposed to get on that bus and go home. Did nobody tell you to go to the store?" And that's what I grew up with. That's what I always remember, is that you were always told that when you leave this house, you're representing this family. You are representing everybody here in this house, in this family, mm-hmm. and you took that with you. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate my mom telling me that, and my dad and my grandmother, because I think it made you have a sense of pride. And it also kept you on track too. It Absolutely. Kept you on track because you knew somebody's watching me. So, and it felt good too. You were kind of nervous about it, but it felt good at the same time. But my street, like I said, was between Mason and Skidmore, and it was diverse back then. I will say there was we had an Asian family on our block. We had 2 Latino families on our block. Several white families on our block, and everyone else was black. But what we had in common is that it was all working class, middle class families, mm-hmm. working class and lower class, I would say. But we had that in common. And so even though it was, now you look on some blocks in that neighborhood and you'll see a few black families, so mostly white families. But what the difference is that those white families, they're in a whole different economic status than those black families. Absolutely. And so that's where I feel like there's that divide now, because it's not the same. Back then, we all got along because we were all in it. We were all in it together. Exactly. We were all in it together. Nobody felt any different. My white friends that went to Boise, I didn't go to Boise, but we all played together after school.
Right.
And we were all the same. But I appreciate that part about it. Now, my parents, and they tell a whole different story, like him saying, you know, they grew up right around here where we are right now. And they have that everybody, every family knew each other. They all came here, you know, different families came here from the South or from East Coast or the Midwest. They had that sense of community. So I do feel like it was different than what we experienced, but I still got to experience that, but just in a different level of connectedness.
Because we all are similar, you know, because of the fact that we all were in this albino neighborhood at that time, everybody is connected because such and such did the electricity, somebody else did the plumbing. This, you know, if you still to this day, you can come in the salon and ask, oh, who does such and such work? You know, if someone in the salon doesn't know, then we'll put the back call out and we'll find out who does it. You know, Karis reminded me of a story that is similar and dissimilar at the same time. The house next door to us right now, a Caucasian lady lived in it, and she told my grandmother that, she said, Miss Dean, I'm gonna let you buy this house so you guys can have a little colored village. Right? And my grandmother said, okay. So she bought the house. The house is still in our family. And I tell anybody that asks me, if I get enough money, I'm buying the block and it's gonna have a sign at the top of MLK that says, welcome to the colored village. I think all the black people that grew up in Northeast Portland will appreciate that. They're like, okay, we'll right on. Because at that time, they were trying to get away from us. And we were moving in.
Flight.
White flight, exactly. And I grew up in Irvington where the houses now are $700,000, $800,000, $1 million. And we didn't go on the other side of 15th. And Cleo's in-laws live on the other side of 15th. But I know when we were growing up, there was one, two, maybe a few families, but it wasn't a lot. And then we're riding our bikes and we get to 15th and we turn around and go back because we felt like we were only supposed to be in a certain neighborhood. And now we're not even supposed to be in the neighborhood that we were supposed to be in. So it's interesting to see the differences, and that's why I was asking the questions like, what did you think about growing up in your neighborhood versus how I felt growing up in this neighborhood? And we used to run up and down Hancock and play racing and doing the most. But there were kids out here. Now people are looking at you like,
Right.
why are these kids outside? Because I'm riding my bike. There was a boundary we set up with how we lived, and we were always connected to each other, and we wanted everybody to succeed. But now, since we're so separated, it's hard for us to come back together and keep pushing each other forward, because Portland is such a small city in the first place. And then when you start separating us, then we lose our cohesiveness. So, Mr. Jamie, would you like to tell us anything about where you live now? Well, you said you live in your family home now, right? I'm sorry. Yeah. You did say that. And is the neighborhood, has it changed since you've been there?
Very much. So kind of like to your point, like it feels like I have neighbors, but I don't live in a neighborhood. It's like, I mean, I remember growing up there, whenever someone new would move into the neighborhood, they would come by, or there'd be some sort of meeting of the families where we would get to know like who was moving into the neighborhood. But lately, I mean, I've seen families come and go and not have one conversation with them. So it feels fractured on many levels. There are still some families there from when I grew up there, which I appreciate, but even just the interactions are just different, and just the feel of the neighborhood is different. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to live in that house, and I'm a teacher, and so otherwise I would not be able to live in that neighborhood if it wasn't a family home, so I couldn't afford it. So I feel very like privileged to have that opportunity, but it definitely does not feel the same as when I was growing up.
Thank you. Cleo, I know you, and I know you have some really cool stories. So you want to give us any cool information that the public might not know about your growing up or your family in Northeast Portland?
Okay, it's kind of tough when there's all these little pieces, but I'll try to keep it in the context of what we're talking about, right? So really, so my mom's side of the family, well, both of my grandparents migrated here from the South, and via my dad's side via Arizona, so the Southwest, which is it's a whole different story, you know. And my grandfather from my dad's side was a Garveyite and a civil rights activist in Phoenix. So the racism in Phoenix was a whole different piece, because you had you know, different Native Americans, Apaches, Pueblos, different Latinx folks, Mexicans, and you also weren't allowed, the white folks forced them to say no blacks allowed in Mexican establishments. So anyhow, my grandparents on my father's side would come here for the summer. So they brought properties here. And then my mother's side came here from Mississippi and Alabama. And my mom was born here. My father wasn't. It's interesting because coming from property ownership, you get to see different parts of the greater community. I think that's why my perspective was that way. I just started to catch on when I heard you guys speaking. You guys were saying your neighborhood, and it was like what the neighborhood that the surrounding areas. Mm-hmm. But I was looking at all of Albina, right? Because we have all these, we had these different properties, and we grew up on these different properties, whether we were managing them or running a business within them. So I think something interesting is right around the corner from here, on Sacramento Street, was a property that my grandmother and father was setting up for the family for generational wealth. You guys were speaking about generational wealth. It was a 7-unit apartment building with a little small, like, shotgun serving quarters behind it. The city had red tagged both of the structures. And red tagging is basically eminent domain for a structure, you know. And the way they did our community, the way they did our neighborhoods, was just arbitrary things on the books. So we had purchased that apartment building for about $20,000, as well as the home. The whole property was $20,000, and we had speculated that it would take about another 15, so a total of $30,000 to get that property renovated and everything. But the city denied it. And long story short, my grandmother and father fought, went to city council and everything, and they demolished the 7-unit apartment building. But they did allow us to keep the little house in the back, which required more work than the actual. Yeah. And the thing about it is, you know, my grandparents bought properties. You know, it was really hard to buy properties in Portland in general, but buying properties here and renting them out to folks in the community so that we would have a place to stay. So that was something that, and I was really excited to get this apartment building going. So really, it bothered me for a long for a long time. I think I held on to it more than, well, I think my grandmother and I held on to it. But, you know, a lot of folks in the community a lot of folks in the family were excited to get that apartment building going. But so in 2019, my wife, Keen, and I, we were doing an artist residency at the City of Portland Archives. So I took the time to gather up all the documentation, information. We were doing a research piece and art about that. So, I mean, we stayed in there. We studied all types of ordinances, redlining, red tagging, all kind of things that happen to the Black community. And and just by chance, there was a 1896 Queen Anne Victorian that was set to be demolished. That was like one house down from where our apartment building, that property is, which now at that time looked like it just had a big yard with a little house in the back because the apartment had been demolished. So I called up the city planners and told them we got a place to move that house. And, you know, just a little tidbit about it. It tripped me out because, you know, this is just like 3 or 4 blocks away from here. And there's a lot of white folks on that block, and it used to didn't be white folks. And it reminded me the way they were talking about this house was like how they do their animals.
Wow.
Right? Like all this stuff about dogs and this, that, and the other, but don't give a damn about no black folks, you know? And I don't expect them to. I'm just saying.
Right.
And so it's all this stuff about this historic home and how we can't lose these historic homes. And so I'm the steward of that property right now. And ever since that apartment building had been demolished, we had always been getting harassed. You know, like if you let the grass grow a little bit, they'll just come and mow the lawn. You know, all these things, and then send you the bill. If you don't pay, you know, you get a lien on your property. So, all kind of weird stuff with the garbage service. Just, it was always strange. So anyhow, when the city was really excited about us, you know, having a spot to move the house, but I didn't mention to the city the history of that property until after we signed the contracts. Once we signed the contracts, and they were asking about, you know, certain policies on how that property was going to be situated, whether it was going to be called, when you move the house there, is that going to be called an ADU in the back, or do we have to do a flag lot? All these planning terms. And so I said, was it called an ADU when we had our 7-unit apartment building there? Did we have to do a flag lot?
I hate to cut you off.
Oh, sorry.
You're fine. You're fine. No, because this is a story that can go on and on and on, and we have to kind of wrap this up.
I like that one.
But does anyone have the last word? Jamie, you have anything that you would like to add to that real quick?
Would you like to? I don't know.
Sure. Or we have it.
Go ahead, Karis. You're going to be the last one to speak.
Okay. I kind of trying to remember what I was so into this. I was so into the story. The story was good. The story was good. I guess the one thing that I would say, kind of around what you were saying about how the neighborhood has changed and how we don't see that cohesiveness with the new and the, I'd say, seasoned originators of the neighborhood. We don't see that because there isn't an understanding. And I think what is very important is to understand the neighborhood that you come into. And I know Cleo and I have been on some various committees where we've talked about just this, where when you come in, learn the history. I've lived other places, but I've never gone somewhere and not tried to learn about it, you know, and that gives you a respect for the community. But I think that a lot of people now, they just come to Portland because I saw it on the Food Network, or I saw it on Grimm, or I saw it on, you know, you fill in the blank, because we're the hot place to be. And I know that for a fact. I serve on a board where we get that information from Travel Portland, that I have been like in the top 10 of cities to move to for the past 10 years. So I would just urge people, when you come, take the time to learn, because we've done a lot of things like this. Cleo and his wife have been a part of several art installments around the city that are trying to tell that story. So when you go into that community, you can see that piece of art that has the history of, talking about along Williams, along Alberta. So there's been an effort for people to learn, to teach, because we want to teach the rich history of that. I have the opportunity at work, we're celebrating Black History Month, of course, and so I take that on and like, y'all gonna learn today. I'm gonna put something out here on this employee intranet every week. And so last week I highlighted the mayor of Northeast Portland, Mr. Paul Knowles. And I had so many colleagues email me back and say, I didn't know this. I didn't know about the Cotton Club. Sammy Davis Jr. played there. Like, I didn't know that the Blazers took their ticker tape parade from downtown in 1977 and took it on Geneva's on Williams Avenue. And they didn't know these things. And it's like, no, you need to know these things. There's a deep history of Black people in the city of Portland. The numbers have always been few, but it's been strong and it's been rich. And those stories have to be told and they have to be passed on. And I know that you pass them on to your kids. I know you pass them on to your kids, you will too. And one day, don't rush.
I'm not.
I'm passing them on to my kids as well, but I want them to know that. And that my kids probably get tired of me telling them, that's so-and-so's mom, you go, and but I want them to know that. They need to know that because we don't want to lose that. And we don't want to, I can't remember the quote, but anyway, but if you don't know your history, then it's just, it's so detrimental. I just think it's detrimental. So I'll leave it with that.
Oh, I would like to say thank you to you all three. Thank you for your comments, thank you for your thoughts, and thank you for your time. Thank you.